Munich, Germany, May 8, 1945. The radio crackled with static, then silence. Gudrun Himmler, 16 years old, pressed her palm against the carved mahogany of her father's desk. The wood felt cold, though spring sunlight streamed through the study windows. Outside, somewhere in the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer CC, architect of industrialized murder, her beloved puppy, was running. She did not yet know that within 3 weeks he would bite down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth, ending his life in a British interrogation room. She knew only that the world had ended, and that her father's name, her name, would carry a weight that would never lift. In that moment, as church bells began to ring across a shattered continent, Gudrun made a choice that would define the next 73 years of her life. She would never apologize for her father's honor. She was not alone in bearing this burden. Across Germany and Austria, other children of the Nazi elite faced the same terrible inheritance, a surname that carried the stench of gas chambers, the screams of the dying, the ashes of 6 million Jews. The believer Gudrun Himmler's childhood had been a fairy tale written in blood. Born in 1929, she grew up in a world where her father was not a mass murderer, but a devoted papi who brought her chocolates from his travels, who called her his puppy, his little doll. She attended rallies where hundreds of thousands raised their arms in salute. She wore the crisp uniform of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, her blonde braids perfect symbols of Aryan purity. The photographs from those years show a smiling girl in white knee socks holding her father's hand at Dachau. Yes, Dachau, that name that would become synonymous with horror. But in 1941, when Himmler took his daughter to tour the camp, she saw only orderly barracks and her father's pride in German efficiency. She did not see the prisoners, or perhaps she saw them as her father did, as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the Reich. When the war ended, Gudrun was placed in an internment camp with her mother. 4 years she spent there, from 16 to 20, the most formative years of a young woman's life. Other children of Nazis emerged from such experiences changed, ashamed, desperate to shed their past like a snake sheds skin. Not Gudrun. In 1951, she helped found Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene und Internierte, silent assistance for prisoners of war and interned persons. The name was innocuous, charitable even. The reality was a network dedicated to helping former SS members escape justice. For decades, she worked tirelessly, visiting old Nazis in prison, raising money for their legal defenses, helping war criminals flee to South America. "My father was a great man," she would say, even in her 80s. What he did for Germany. She attended neo-Nazi rallies well into the 21st century, a silver-haired woman in sensible shoes, surrounded by young men with swastika tattoos. When journalists confronted her with evidence of the Holocaust, with photographs of corpses stacked like cordwood, with testimony from survivors, she would smile that same smile from the childhood photographs and say, "I do not believe it." Gudrun Himmler died in May 2018, at 88 years old, never having wavered in her devotion to her father's memory. She left behind no children, having devoted her life instead to the children of the SS, a mother to murderers, a guardian of guilty men. The converter Martin Bormann Jr. made the opposite journey, though the destination was no less complex. Born in April 1930, named after his godfather Adolf Hitler, Martin grew up as Nazi royalty. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., was Hitler's private secretary, the man who controlled access to the Führer, who signed the orders that implemented the Holocaust with bureaucratic precision. The Bormann children, 10 in all, each with a name connected to the Nazi pantheon, lived in luxury even as Europe burned. When the Reich collapsed, Martin was 15. His father disappeared into the chaos of Berlin's final days, his body not found until 1972 during excavation work near the Führer bunker. For decades, Martin Jr. lived with the possibility that his father might still be alive, hiding in South America like so many other Nazi fugitives. But Martin chose a different path. In 1959, at 29 years old, he converted to Catholicism. Not the comfortable Catholicism of Sunday masses and Christmas services, but the radical Catholicism of missionary work and poverty. He became a priest, then a missionary to Africa, teaching in the Congo, where he contracted malaria and nearly died. "I am not my father," he told interviewers who sought him out in remote mission stations. "I must atone for his sins through my own work." The narrative should have ended there. The Nazi's son becomes a man of God, redemption through service. But life is more complicated than redemption stories. In the 1990s, former students came forward with allegations of brutal corporal punishment, of psychological abuse masked as discipline. Martin denied the charges, but the pattern was clear. The violence of the father had found new expression in the son, dressed now in priestly robes rather than CC black. He died in March 1913, at 83, a man who had spent his life trying to outrun his surname, only to discover that some inheritances cannot be escaped through geography or faith or even genuine desire for goodness. The accuser, Nicholas Frank, chose the cruelest path of all. He became his father's prosecutor. Born in March 1939, Nicholas was the youngest son of Hans Frank, Hitler's personal lawyer and later the Governor-General of occupied Poland. Hans Frank earned his nickname the Butcher of Poland through policies that led to the deaths of millions of Poles and Jews. But to young Nicholas, he was simply father, distant, often absent, occasionally affectionate. The Frank family lived in Wawel Castle in Krakow, the ancient seat of Polish kings, requisitioned by the Reich. Nicholas's earliest memories were of marble floors and Renaissance tapestries, of servants and luxury paid for with Jewish gold, with Polish blood. He was 6 years old when the war ended, young enough that his memories were fragmented, dreamlike. His father was hanged at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946. Nicholas was 7. For years, he carried a child's memory of a father who bounced him on his knee, who gave him toy soldiers, who represented strength and authority. Then, in his 30s, Nicholas began to read. He read the transcripts from Nuremberg, the testimony of survivors, his father's own diaries. Hans Frank had kept meticulous records, 43 volumes of them, documenting his crimes with bureaucratic pride. In those pages, Nicholas found not a father, but a monster who had joked about the murder of Jews, who had stolen art and treasure while children starved, who had lived in obscene luxury while orchestrating genocide. In 1987, Nicholas published Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, The Father, a Reckoning. It was not a book, it was an exorcism, a public murder of his father's memory. He did not simply criticize or contextualize, he eviscerated, mocked, degraded. He described imagining his father's execution in graphic detail, finding pleasure in the image of the rope tightening. "I hate my father," he said in interviews over and over, a mantra of rejection. He was human garbage. For 40 years, Nicholas toured Germany and Poland, speaking in schools, showing photographs of Holocaust victims to teenagers who squirmed in their seats. He carried a picture of his father's corpse on the gallows, showing it to anyone who would look. "This is what happens to Nazis," he would say. "This is what my father deserved." Some saw him as a moral hero, a man who chose truth over filial loyalty. Others saw a man trapped in an endless performance of hatred, unable to move beyond his father's shadow even through rejection. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the children of monsters have no good choices, only different forms of damage. The heiress Edda Göring's childhood was golden, literally. Her father, Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and Hitler's designated successor, showered his only child with treasures looted from across Europe. Born in June 1938, named after Mussolini's daughter, Edda grew up in Karinhall, a vast estate north of Berlin, filled with stolen art worth millions. She was 7 when her father was captured, 7 when she watched him on trial at Nuremberg via newsreels, 7 when he cheated the hangman with poison on October 15, 1946, just one day before Hans Frank's execution. Unlike the other children, Edda never publicly denounced or defended her father. She simply fought for what she believed was rightfully hers: the fortune, the art, the material remnants of the Reich's plunder. For decades, she waged legal battles against the German state, demanding the return of property seized after the war. "It belonged to my father," she said. "Therefore, it belongs to me." The law disagreed. Courts ruled that Göring had no right to stolen property, and neither did his daughter. But Edda continued her quiet life in Munich, working as a nurse, living modestly, never granting interviews, never explaining herself. She married in 1967, a quiet ceremony, and took her husband's name, a small mercy of anonymity. When she died in December 2018, at 80 years old, obituaries struggled to define her. She was not a crusader like Gudrun, not a penitent like Martin, not an accuser like Nicholas. She was simply a woman who believed that her father's love for her was separate from his crimes, that she could keep the memory of Papi without endorsing the Reich Marshal. Perhaps that too is a choice, to compartmentalize, to remember the private man while ignoring the public monster. Whether it is a sustainable choice is another question entirely. The son of the angel of death. Rolf Mengele learned the truth about his father the way most children learn about sex, gradually, in fragments, with growing horror. Born in March 1944, Rolf never met Josef Mengele during the war. His father, the doctor who conducted grotesque experiments on twins and other prisoners at Auschwitz, fled Germany in 1949 when Rolf was 5. For years, Rolf believed his father was dead, killed during the war. Then, in 1959, at 15, his mother told him the truth. His father was alive, hiding in South America. More than that, his father was wanted for crimes so monstrous that newspapers called him the Angel of Death. Rolf read about the experiments, the injections of dye into children's eyes to try to change their color, the vivisections performed without anesthesia, the twins sewn together to create conjoined bodies, the thousands who died screaming on his father's operating tables. In 1977, at 33, Rolf traveled to Brazil to confront his father. They spent 2 weeks together in a small house near São Paulo. Josef Mengele, now 66, showed no remorse. He spoke of his work at Auschwitz as scientific research necessary for the advancement of medicine. He showed his son photographs of twins he had studied, smiling in the pictures like a proud researcher with his subjects. "The Jews were Germany's misfortune," Josef told his son. "What I did was necessary." Rolf did not turn his father into authorities. He did not report the location. He returned to Germany, changed his name, and disappeared into private life, becoming a lawyer in the obscurity of a small Bavarian town. When Josef Mengele drowned while swimming in 1979, Rolf did not attend the burial. When German authorities asked for help locating the body in 1985, Rolf provided the information but granted no interviews. "I condemn my father's crimes," he said once, in a rare statement, "but I cannot deny he was my father." It is perhaps the most human response and the most troubling. The recognition that love and horror can coexist, that biological connection creates bonds that even the most monstrous crimes cannot fully sever. The defender Wolf Rüdiger Hess spent 71 years trying to prove his father was innocent. Born in November 1937, Wolf was the only child of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who made his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941, apparently hoping to negotiate peace. Hess spent the rest of his life in prison, first British, then at Nuremberg, then in Spandau prison in Berlin, where he was the sole inmate for the last 21 years of his life. Wolf became his father's champion, his defender, his public relations campaign. He founded organizations to argue for Rudolf's release, wrote books claiming his father was a man of peace, insisted the Nuremberg trials were victor's justice, a sham. "My father was a hero," Wolf repeated endlessly. "He tried to stop the war." When Rudolf Hess died in August 1987 at 93, officially by suicide, Wolf immediately claimed murder. He spent decades promoting conspiracy theories, aligning himself with neo-Nazis, speaking at rallies that mixed genuine grievance with Holocaust denial. Wolf Hess died in November 2001, having spent his entire adult life in service to his father's memory. He never married, had no children, devoted himself entirely to the rehabilitation of a name that could not be rehabilitated. The architect's son, Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's architect, tried the quietest escape of all, excellence in the same profession that made his father famous. Born in July 1934, Albert grew up in luxury, the son of the Reich's master builder. His father designed the massive rallies at Nuremberg, the grandiose plans for Germania, Hitler's vision of a rebuilt Berlin that would be the capital of the world. After the war, Albert Speer Sr. served 20 years in Spandau prison, then emerged to become a best-selling author, the good Nazi who claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. Albert Jr. became an architect too, but focused on urban planning, on human-scale buildings rather than monuments to power. He designed the Olympic Village for the 2008 Beijing Games, parks and public spaces, sustainable developments. He rarely gave interviews about his father, deflecting questions with professional politeness. "I am not my father," he would say. "I am my own person." He worked for decades in Frankfurt, then in China. Always competent, always professional, always private. When his father died in 1981, Albert attended the funeral but made no public statement. When journalists came asking about the past, he simply declined to comment. Albert Speer Jr. died in September 2017 at 83, having built a successful career in the shadow of his father's name without ever publicly confronting or defending it. He chose the path of silence, of work, of letting achievements speak louder than ancestry. Whether this constitutes escape or merely a different form of imprisonment is a question each observer must answer for themselves. The inheritance. These 7 lives, Gudrun the believer, Martin the converter, Nicholas the accuser, Edda the heiress, Rolf the silent, Wolf the defender, Albert the professional, represent the spectrum of responses available to the children of absolute evil. None of them chose their fathers. None of them participated in their fathers' crimes. Yet all of them bore the weight of names that would forever be associated with humanity's darkest chapter. They were not victims of the Holocaust, but they were casualties of the Reich in a different way. Children who inherited not wealth or wisdom, but the burden of explaining, defending, rejecting, or simply carrying a surname that had been transformed into a curse. Some, like Gudrun and Wolf, chose devotion, wrapping themselves in the flags of the Reich's mythology, protecting their fathers' memories with the same fanaticism their fathers had brought to ideology. Others, like Nicholas, chose public repudiation so complete it bordered on self-destruction, attacking their fathers with the vehemence of prosecutors rather than sons. Still others, like Rolf and Albert, chose privacy, building walls between public legacy and private memory, refusing to perform their pain or their loyalty for the cameras. There is a particular cruelty in being born to a monster. If you defend them, you become complicit. If you attack them, you betray the most fundamental human loyalty. If you remain silent, you are accused of cowardice or complicity by silence. There are no good options, only different forms of damage. Yet within this darkness, there are also questions that resonate beyond these specific biographies. What do we owe to our parents? How do we separate love from approval, biological connection from moral endorsement? Can sins be inherited or only their consequences? Is blood loyalty a virtue or a vice? These children of the Reich lived their lives in the shadow of gas chambers and mass graves. They attended schools where their classmates whispered their surnames like curses. They applied for jobs, knowing that their last names would appear on application forms like a warning label. They dated, married, had children, or chose not to, always carrying the knowledge that their genetic legacy was not just brown eyes or musical talent, but connection to industrialized murder. The last of them died recently. Gudrun in 2018, Edda the same year, spanning nearly a century from the Reich's height to the era of smartphones and social media. With their deaths, the direct line between the perpetrators and their offspring is finally severed. What remains is not the individuals, but the question they embodied. What responsibility do we bear for the sins of our fathers? History offers no simple answer, but perhaps that is appropriate. Simple answers are what the Reich offered. Simple solutions to complex problems, simple scapegoats for complicated grievances, simple hierarchies of human worth that justified infinite cruelty. The lives of these children suggest that the only honest response to inherited evil is complexity, acknowledgement without excuses, distance without denial, the painful work of separating identity from inheritance. Some manage this better than others. Some never managed it at all. But all of them carried the weight of a name, a burden they did not choose but could never put down. In this, perhaps, there is a warning for all of us, that the consequences of our actions extend beyond our lifetimes, that what we do is inherited by our children, that the dead cast long shadows over the living. The Reich promised to last 1,000 years. It lasted 12. But for the children of its leaders, those 12 years stretched across entire lifetimes, defining and constraining and haunting until the very end. That perhaps is the final justice, that the perpetrators died or were executed, but their names, their children, their legacy lived on as testimony to the truth that evil is not abstract or distant, but personal, specific, carried in surnames and genetic code, inherited like eye color or a tendency toward illness. the weight of a name, the burden of blood, the impossible inheritance of absolute evil. These are the stories of those who bore it.